In the shadows of history, there are names that stir fear, respect, and awe. Hidden from the light of day, powerful forces have shaped the world with their silent grip, creating empires built on blood, betrayal, and violence. From the streets of Sicily to the heart of Japan, from the jungles of Colombia to the towers of New York, criminal syndicates have ruled in the dark, leaving legacies of power that still echo today. The Black Hand, the Yakuza, the Medellín Cartel, the Gambino, DeCavalcante, Bonanno, and Genovese crime families. These names aren't just whispers in alleyways. They are empires forged in fire and loyalty, where honor is bought with blood and betrayal is just another part of the game. This is the story of the men and women who controlled the shadows, the ruthless, the cunning, and the deadly. These are the stories of crime, power, and survival, where nothing is ever what it seems, and the stakes are life and death. Step into a world where the line between law and lawlessness is blurred, and the shadows are always watching. Welcome to the Underworld. The Black Hand, the shadow that controlled the Underworld. It began with a whisper, a name spoken only in hushed tones. No one knew exactly when or where it started. Some claimed the slums of Naples, others the immigrant-packed streets of New York. But by the time the Black Hand revealed itself, it was already too late. It did not arrive with fanfare, nor did it declare war openly. It simply took hold of the city like a creeping shadow, its tendrils wrapping around the throats of those who could not escape. The first sign was always the same, a letter. Simple, unassuming, but soaked in dread. Written in shaky yet deliberate scrawl, the message was clear: pay or you die. And at the bottom, stamped in thick black ink, was the mark of terror itself, a human handprint, its fingers spread wide, like a specter reaching from the grave. At first the victims were small, shopkeepers, butchers, tailors, men who had worked their fingers raw to build a new life in America. They had escaped war, famine, and oppression, only to be ensnared by something far worse. The Black Hand did not care for their struggles. It demanded tribute, and those who refused were taught brutal lessons. A severed ear left on a doorstep. A child snatched from the streets returned days later, their lips blue, their breath forever stolen. A man found hanging in an alley, his chest marked with the unmistakable blackened print, burned into his flesh with acid. Fear spread like a sickness. Conversations turned into whispers, doors locked before sunset, and the once lively streets of Little Italy grew eerily silent at night. Even the police hesitated to interfere, for the Black Hand had ways of ensuring silence. Witnesses disappeared, officers were bribed, threatened, or worse, found floating face down in the river, their bodies bloated, their mouths stuffed with black-stained rags. But the Black Hand was not a single entity. It was not one man, nor one group. It was an idea, a network of terror stretching across the country, its members bound not by loyalty, but by fear of the very machine they had helped build. There were no kings in this underworld, only executioners. It fed on secrecy, thrived in the dark, and when it struck, it left no trace beyond bloodstains and grief. Yet every monster has a hunter, and for the Black Hand, that hunter was Joseph Petrosino. A detective of Italian descent, he knew the fear that gripped his people. He had seen the terror in their eyes, the way they flinched at shadows. But unlike them, he was not afraid. He did not cower when the letters arrived, nor did he shrink when bodies were found. Instead, he studied. He infiltrated. He traced the ink-stained threats back to their origins, followed the whispers to the men who spoke them. He was a ghost in their world, moving unseen, gathering names, collecting proof. The Black Hand had killed countless men, but they had never faced someone like Petrosino. He did not fear them. He did not hesitate. He fought them as no one had dared before. And for the first time the Black Hand felt something it had never known: pressure. They responded the only way they knew how. In 1909, under the dim glow of Sicilian street lamps, Joseph Petrosino was gunned down, his body riddled with bullets before he had the chance to fight back. It was a warning, a final letter written in blood. The Black Hand had spoken. But they had miscalculated. Instead of silencing the city, they awakened something far worse. Petrosino's murder was a spark, igniting a fury that could not be contained. The police, once fearful, struck back with force. Raids shattered the Syndicates' networks, arrests ripped apart its ranks, and soon the Black Hand began to crumble. Its members, once untouchable, now faced the noose, the cell, the grave. The letters stopped. The severed ears, the bodies in the alleys. They vanished. One by one, the Black Hand's men faded into obscurity, their legacy buried beneath the very fear they had cultivated. But legends do not die so easily. Some say the Black Hand never truly disappeared, that it simply evolved, slithering into the folds of what would become the modern mafia. Others claim its remnants still exist in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. After all, fear is a patient thing. It does not need to be seen to exist, it only needs to be remembered. And in the darkest corners of the world, the Black Handprint still lingers. The Yakuza, blood, honor, and the shadows of death. It began in the alleys of feudal Japan, long before the world knew the name Yakuza. Before the tattoos, the severed fingers, and the unspoken rules of honor, they were just men. Outcasts, gamblers, warriors without a master. They lived in the spaces where law did not reach, in the underbelly of a society that refused to claim them. And from that darkness, they forged something unbreakable. The Yakuza were not born in fire and blood. They were shaped by it. The first to bear the name were the Bakuto, traveling gamblers who roamed from town to town, their faces hidden beneath straw hats, their games rigged long before the dice ever touched the ground. Those who lost and refused to pay would find themselves faced with a blade, a simple choice offered with a cold stare: their money or their life. Then came the tekiya, the merchants who sold stolen goods under the cover of night, their stalls filled with trinkets taken from the unsuspecting, their profits protected by knives hidden beneath their robes. But even thieves needed order. And in the lawless corners of Japan, these men built something resembling structure, a hierarchy, a code, a brotherhood bound by blood and silence. By the time Japan had begun its transformation into the modern world, the Yakuza were no longer just gamblers or merchants. They were something more. A hidden empire, growing beneath the surface of society like roots beneath an ancient tree, unseen but unshakable. They controlled the ports, the markets, the alleys that no one dared walk alone. They were feared, respected, and in some twisted way, admired. But power demands sacrifice, and the Yakuza knew this better than anyone. A man who betrayed his brothers did not die easily. No, that was far too simple. Instead, he would kneel before his boss, his hands trembling, a blade placed before him. His own punishment, his own justice. With a single stroke, he would sever his own pinky finger, the blood dripping onto the tatami mats, a silent apology carved into his own flesh. It was called yubitsume, the ritual of atonement. The deeper the crime, the more fingers lost. A handless man was a man with no loyalty left to give. Yet for all their brutality, the Yakuza were not mindless killers. Their world was built on rules, traditions older than the country itself. They did not steal from the weak without cause. They did not harm the innocent without reason. To them, they were not criminals. They were something greater, the unseen hand that guided Japan from the shadows. The government knew they existed, yet they did nothing. Perhaps because, in some twisted way, they needed them. When the earthquakes came, When the bombs fell and left cities in ruin, it was the Yakuza who arrived first, clearing the debris, providing food, restoring order in the way only they knew how. For the people who lived beneath their rule, they were both executioners and saviors. But even the unshakable can fall. The 20th century brought a new kind of enemy, one that could not be bribed, threatened, or cut down with a sword. Laws tightened, governments no longer turned a blind eye, and the underworld found itself cornered. The once proud samurai of the streets were forced into hiding, their tattoos covered, their rituals abandoned, their empire crumbling piece by piece. Yet, the Yakuza do not die easily. Like a serpent shedding its skin, they changed. The suits replaced the robes, the boardrooms replaced the gambling dens. And where once they ruled the alleys, now they ruled from behind desks, their power unseen but no less deadly. Some say the Yakuza are weaker now, a relic of an age that no longer exists. But those who truly understand the darkness know better. They do not disappear. They do not fade. They wait. Because power, once taken, is never given back. It is only borrowed, and the debt is always collected. The Medellín Cartel, the reign of blood and cocaine. It began in the shadows of Colombia, in the humid streets of Medellín, where ambition and brutality walked hand in hand. In the late 1970s, the world barely knew the name Pablo Escobar. He was just a man, a smuggler with a keen eye for opportunity, and a mind sharper than the knives that would one day slit the throats of those who stood in his way. He understood something no one else did, that the world was hungry, not for food, not for gold, but for escape, and in the white powder of cocaine, he found his empire. At first it was small. Smugglers carried packages across the borders, hidden in suitcases, tucked into bodies, swallowed whole. The money trickled in, then it poured, then it flooded. Soon Escobar had more cash than he could count, mountains of bills stored in warehouses, eaten away by rats before they could even be spent. It was not just a business, it was an industry. And Escobar was not just a businessman, he was a king. The Medellín cartel was born from this hunger, and it grew like a cancer, spreading its influence from Colombia to Miami, New York, and beyond. The streets of America ran white with cocaine, and the veins of its people pulsed with the poison Escobar supplied. But empires are built on blood, and Escobar's was no exception. The police, the government, even the military, all were either on his payroll or in his crosshairs. Judges who ruled against him were found in ditches, their tongues cut from their mouths. Politicians who spoke too loudly disappeared, their families left to mourn in silence. An airplane was blown from the sky, a single act of terror that sent a message the world could not ignore. Pablo Escobar did not negotiate. He did not ask for power. He took it. In Medellín, he was not just feared, he was worshipped. He built homes for the poor, funded hospitals, gave money to those who needed it, and in return the people protected him, hiding him from the government that sought to bring him down. He was a ghost, moving through the city like a legend, untouchable, unstoppable. But even the most feared men make mistakes. Escobar believed himself invincible. He declared war on the Colombian government, assassinating officials, bombing buildings, turning the streets into war zones. He believed that money could buy everything, that bullets could solve anything. But power is a fragile thing, and the more he fought to keep it, the more it slipped through his fingers. The Americans came first, their agents hunting him like an animal. Then came the rival cartels, hungry for his throne. And finally, his own people, the very men who had once sworn loyalty, turned on him, tired of living in the shadow of a man who had become a god in his own mind. On December 2nd, 1993, it ended. A single gunshot, a body sprawled across a rooftop, the king of cocaine lying in a pool of his own blood. The empire he had built, the billions he had made, the power he had once wielded. It all vanished in an instant. But the Medellín cartel did not die with Escobar. The violence, the corruption, the hunger, it only shifted hands. Another cartel rose. Then another, and another. The streets still run red, the cocaine still flows, and the ghosts of Medellín still whisper in the dark. Because power does not die. It only waits. The Gambino crime family, a legacy of power and blood. In the dark, fog-shrouded streets of New York City, where neon lights flickered over crumbling buildings and whispers of betrayal lingered in the air, a deadly force was silently rising. The Gambino crime family, named after its patriarch Carlo Gambino, began its bloody rise in the 1950s, but its roots stretched far deeper into the underworld of organized crime. Carlo Gambino, a man whose name would come to be whispered in fear and awe, entered the criminal world as a young immigrant from Sicily. His quiet, calculating demeanor masked a brutal ambition that would eventually see him rise to power at the head of one of the most notorious mafia families in the world. But Gambino's ascent to power was no accident, and the path he took was paved in blood. Carlo's rise to the head of the Gambino family began with the murder of his predecessor, Albert Anastasia, the ruthless boss of the family. In a plot orchestrated with chilling precision, Anastasia was gunned down in the barber's chair of his Manhattan office, a gruesome spectacle that set the tone for the years to come. But this was only the beginning. The shadows of New York were filled with other criminal families. The Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, each vying for control of the city's vast network of illegal operations. The Gambino family was no stranger to violence. Carlo Gambino ruled with an iron fist, but understood the art of subtlety. He let his enemies destroy each other while he quietly expanded his empire. Under his leadership, the family took control of the lucrative rackets, smuggling, gambling, extortion, and eventually the narcotics trade. The family became a spider at the center of a web, pulling strings in politics, law enforcement, and business. Gambino's death in 1976 was a turning point, but the family's reign did not end. His successor, Paul Castellano, an astute businessman, took control, and the family continued to thrive. However, Castellano's reign was fraught with tension. He was seen by many as too focused on legitimate business ventures and too distant from the brutal nature of the family's origins. This created a deep rift with the rest of the family, and eventually, the tension erupted into violence. In a chilling act of betrayal, John Gotti, one of the most feared and charismatic figures in the Gambino family, orchestrated the murder of Castellano in 1985. The cold, calculated nature of the hit sent shockwaves through the underworld. Gotti, dubbed the Teflon Don for his ability to evade conviction, became the new boss of the family. Under his rule, the Gambino family would experience a new era of bloodshed, power, and treachery. The streets of New York would become Gotti's battleground. His brutal tactics ensured that no one stood in his way, and soon his family's empire reached unprecedented heights. Gotti became a household name, his criminal activities so extensive and brazen that the media couldn't get enough of him. But like all who rise to power through murder and manipulation, Gotti's reign would not last forever. In 1992, he was convicted of murder, racketeering, and other crimes, and his empire began to unravel. The fall of the Gambino crime family did not mark the end of its legacy. Even as law enforcement closed in on the organization, the dark legacy of blood, betrayal, and ruthless ambition continued to echo through the streets of New York. The Gambino name, though tarnished by scandal and violence, still casts a long shadow over the city, a reminder of the horrors that once thrived in the dark corners of the underworld. As the years have passed, the Gambino family's power has waned, but its influence remains. New generations of criminals, learning from the mistakes of the past, have continued to operate under the shadows of the old empire. The streets of New York, once ruled by the mafia, now bear the scars of the past, each corner whispering the name of the Gambino family and the blood that stained its legacy. The horror of the Gambino crime family lies not just in its violent rise and fall, but in the chilling realization that the cycle of crime, power, and bloodshed never truly ends. It lurks beneath the surface, waiting for its next victim. The DeCavalcante crime family, a blood-soaked legacy of deception. The DeCavalcante crime family, a name that resonates in the shadows of New Jersey, began its rise to power in the late 1940s, a tale of brutal ambition and bloody conquest. What was initially a small-time operation soon became a full-fledged mafia family, involved in the most nefarious of activities: extortion, loan sharking, and murder. Giovanni "Johnny Boy" DeCavalcante, the patriarch who founded the family, had humble beginnings in the criminal world. He was a man of few words, but many actions. His rise to power, however, was not without its bloodshed. His family, like many before it, expanded through violence, fear, and the careful manipulation of rivals. The DeCavalcante family's operations were built on a foundation of deception. They became experts in hiding their true intentions behind a veil of legitimacy. As the family's empire expanded, they infiltrated businesses and political circles, gaining the trust of influential figures while secretly manipulating them for their own gain. By the 1970s, the DeCavalcante family had their hands in every dirty deal from the tri-state area to beyond. However, the DeCavalcante family's reign was not without its moments of horror. The family became notorious for its extreme methods of enforcing loyalty and settling disputes. Those who dared to cross them were often never seen again, their bodies disappearing into the cold New Jersey landscape. The most infamous tale of such a fate is that of Little Joe, a former member of the family who had become a liability. He was lured into a trap, his throat slit in a dimly lit basement, and his body disposed of in the dead of night. In the 1980s, however, the family's rise began to unravel. Law enforcement had been quietly gathering evidence for years, and in 1982, the DeCavalcante family suffered a massive blow when Johnny Boy was imprisoned. His son, the younger and far more volatile Salvatore "Sammy" DeCavalcante, tried to take control, but the family was already struggling under the weight of law enforcement pressure. Despite the challenges, the DeCavalcante family refused to fade into obscurity. They continued to operate in the shadows, carefully evading the law and exacting brutal revenge on anyone who dared to expose them. But as time passed, the cracks in their empire grew wider. Betrayals and power struggles began to tear the family apart. Sammy, once seen as the heir to the throne, found himself caught in a web of his own making, and eventually, he turned on his own flesh and blood. The horror of the DeCavalcante family lies not just in its blood-stained history, but in the chilling truth that even the most dangerous criminal families eventually implode under the weight of their own corruption. No matter how much power or money they amass, betrayal and fear are always lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to tear everything apart. The Bonanno crime family, a legacy of betrayal and murder. The Bonanno crime family, one of the most notorious families in the history of the American mafia, began its bloody journey in the early 1900s. The family's origins can be traced back to Joseph Bonanno, an ambitious young man from Sicily who would eventually take control of the family that bore his name. Bonanno's rise to power was not an easy one. He fought and schemed his way through a brutal underworld, eliminating rivals and securing his position as the boss of his family. By the 1950s, the Bonanno family had expanded its influence across New York City and into other parts of the country. But despite their success, the Bonannos were plagued by constant tension within their own ranks. The most shocking moment in the Bonanno family's history occurred in 1964, when a brutal power struggle within the family came to a head. Joseph Bonanno, now an aging boss, was nearly killed in a hit orchestrated by his own men. The betrayal came as a result of his attempt to broker a truce between the 5 major mafia families. It was a move that many felt was an attempt to undermine their power and control. Bonanno narrowly escaped the attack, but his life was never the same. The ensuing fallout left the Bonanno family fractured and weakened. Joseph Bonanno, unable to maintain control, was exiled to Arizona, where he lived in obscurity for years. The family, now without its leader, became embroiled in infighting. The streets of New York once again ran red with blood as factions within the family fought for dominance. In the following decades, the Bonanno family would continue to experience violence, betrayal, and murder. But perhaps the most chilling moment came in 1981, when a former ally, Carmine the Beast Romano, was brutally murdered in a hit that left his body dismembered and dumped in a remote location. The cold-blooded execution sent a terrifying message to anyone who dared to defy the Bonanno family. Even as law enforcement cracked down on the family in the 1990s, the Bonanno family's reign of terror did not end. The brutal legacy of betrayal and bloodshed continued to haunt the streets of New York, a reminder of the horrors that could be unleashed when power, greed, and ambition collide. The Genovese crime family, a mastermind's dark empire. The Genovese crime family, often considered the most powerful and secretive of the 5 families of New York, had its origins in the early 1900s. Vito Genovese, a man known for his cunning and ruthlessness, quickly rose through the ranks of the mafia, establishing himself as a master manipulator and a force to be reckoned with. Vito Genovese's rise to power was built on a foundation of calculated violence and strategic alliances. He was a man who understood the importance of control, and he was willing to do whatever it took to secure his position at the top. Under his leadership, the Genovese family became synonymous with efficiency, secrecy, and brutality. One of the darkest chapters in the family's history occurred in the 1950s when Genovese, seeking to expand his control, orchestrated the murder of his rival, Albert Anastasia. The execution, carried out in cold blood, sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. Genovese's rise to power was swift, and he ruled with an iron fist, controlling everything from gambling to narcotics. However, Genovese's reign was not without its challenges. His criminal empire faced constant threats from rival families and law enforcement. The Genovese family's grip on power began to loosen in the 1960s, when Genovese was convicted and imprisoned for a variety of crimes. Yet even from behind bars, Genovese's influence continued to reach far and wide. As the decades passed, the Genovese family faced more betrayals, internal strife, and violence. The horror of their reign was not just in the bloodshed that marked their rise to power, but in the chilling realization that even the most powerful families could crumble under the weight of their own greed and ambition. The legacy of the Genovese family endures to this day, a dark reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows of power and corruption. The family's influence may have waned, but its history of blood and betrayal will never be forgotten.